Wonderful morning, wonderful practice session, a perfectly executed service. Wow, you guys are good. So well. So much wonder in this expansive practice. Sometimes it's difficult to say a word about it, about practice, about awakening. And there's sometimes we want to just go back to sleep. Things can be hard. Yeah? Our life can throw us curveballs, can bring challenges. And that gets particularly difficult if the idea of our life is paired with a narrative of a goal-based mentality, one that has us always looking to be on the increase. It's important for us to, from time to time, bring us back and check our own intentions. How are we approaching our life, and what's it all about? What is our intention as we enter each moment? When we work to manifest our intentions rather than striving for some distant goal, the quality of our life and the quality of our practice changes, and it opens up. There's a short exchange about this in the Blue Cliff record. It's the 41st case. In it, Joshu asks Toshi, when one who has experienced a great death returns to life, then what? And Toshi replies, it's not permitted to go at night. One must get there in daylight. Seems rather cryptic. We have Joshu, who many of you have met, right? I see a lot of eye rolling going on. Oh, Joshu's back. Yeah. Is a way of grinding us to power by using words beyond their ordinary meaning to point to the essence of our lived experience. And it can reach out through centuries to do that. And Joshu seems to be adept at knowing exactly where you're standing and sitting right now. Yeah. And then there's another character here named Toshi. Toshi, in Japanese, literally means great master. So we're talking about an experienced teacher, or maybe even a bodhisattva. The most likely candidate would be his own teacher named Nansen, who we've seen in other cases. And you know Nansen because he has a very clear, grounded wisdom and a sharp teaching style. So sharp, in fact, that he actually used a cat in one of his examples, right? To bring folks out of their place of being confounded and having them actually show up on the present stage of what it is to act with compassion, rather than some Zen trickery or Zen finery. So he works to shock people out of their conceptual attachments. And so these two are meeting, and they're talking about the great death. This isn't a death that we talk about when the light of our eyes is fading, right? It's not talking about necessarily our final breath. It's something much more subtle, much more profound, actually. The great death is that moment when everything we cling to, every scaffolding we use to build the small self, drops away. When this attitude of certainty or control collapses. That's where we find ourselves then. We think, well, I don't want to go to the gallows. I don't want to experience this death. But when the trapdoor falls, what actually happens is that we come to life. But it's hard to see at first. Because there's a story inside each of us. A way we explain who we are, where we've been. A glue that we use to hold this incoherent narrative into one narrative of self. When tragedy hits, though, sudden loss or betrayal or illness, or even a long, quiet season of despair, these stories begin to fracture. And the glue loosens a little bit. And what's our natural instinct to do? Well, you got to patch it up. Right after you grieve, of course, you got to patch that narrative up. We stitch the old pieces together, and we reweave a self that we recognize. right? From all the karmic elements that were there before. Well, if we keep doing that, we're going to keep coming into a cycle of repeating activity in our lived experience. This habit energy is going to have us chasing our own tail. And so this koan is pointing to somewhere much more radical. It doesn't ask us to repair the old self. The question of what happens when we drop it off completely. When we stop, reaching back for a version of who we were before things fell apart, and instead step forward with no mask, no script, and no past to defend against, nothing to be ashamed of. To step forward in true daylight. Toshi's reply is very precise. It's not permitted to go at night. It's not a path of hiding. It's not a path of bypass. It's not about trying to reside in some rarefied notion of emptiness or equanimity. It's not about retreating into cleverness or passivity. It's about full, exposed presence. It's about vulnerability. It's a kind of presence that has nothing left to lose. Because it's nothing. It's grasping nothing. It's already died. And in dying, it came alive. But this kind of return requires a certain type of courage. A courage not to defend the old self, but to recognize yourself in everything. As the wind that's blowing the chimes that are punctuating our moments here. In the rise and fall of the breath of the person residing beside you. You can also find it in the grief that you thought would drown you. And in the laughter that rises. In some subtle joke that passes between you. You are what reveals itself in the clear light beyond the great death. Your true self. Dōgen spoke of this, and we studied it recently in Tenzo Kyōkun, when he says, when you encounter hardships, think of them as the body of the Buddha. When you meet with suffering, think of it as the face of the Tathagata. It's not being poetic, I promise. He's speaking with some degree of precision as to where the path of awakening is. The pain that you carry, the moment when everything fell apart and you weren't sure you'd make it through, that is the face of awakening. That recognition right there, that nothing's going to be the same, that there's nothing to hold on to, that's where awakening resides. That's where we practice. That's the Buddha showing up precisely in the form that we're most tempted to turn away from. There's a case in the Mumonkan where someone holds up a dried stick that you use to wipe your tail and says, this is Buddha. And we all sit and look at that with some degree of revulsion. We say, it's not possible. And yet, without it, I promise you're going to do a lot of suffering. Yeah? Dogen's speaking here not just to a couple of monks. He's speaking to the Tenzo, to the head cook. The person whose job it is to feed everyone, to care for the body of the Sangha. He has to work with what's available. A bruised radish. Some spoiled rice. And he still has to nurture and feed the assembly. Sometimes it's a broken heart. Sometimes it's an unexpected snowstorm. Sometimes it's something unfathomable that's thrown our way. It's all Buddha's body. It's all the Tathagata's face. To live this way is to return not to some abstract idea of life, not to some platitude about fixing one's own self, but to this actual life as it is right here in the daylight. When the bottom falls out of our story, we still try to move forward, but we do it half-heartedly. Sometimes we do it under the cover of darkness. We function in a guarded way. We're doing all of this to step back in the world with a version of ourselves that's been edited to survive. But this koan is telling us to move beyond that form of survival. To meet the world in the daylight is to say, here I am, this is my life, this is what the great death has revealed. And I'm going to savor it. I'm going to walk directly into it without hiding, without pretending to be unchanged. It's not easy, but then again, I never promised any of you it would be easy. There's a kind of silence that comes after suffering that's different. It's not the silence of absence. It's actually the silence of a presence that's so vast it doesn't need to explain itself. There's nothing left to protect and no one left to impress. When we encounter somebody who's been on that path, like Joshu, like Nansen, even in the gap between their words, when nothing is said, we feel it. There's a steadiness that's clear and present. But I promise that light doesn't come from having avoided adversity. It comes from having walked through it, not denied what we saw there, fully integrating it. When we stop looking for ourselves in the mirror of our memory, we can begin to see our own face in everything, reflected everywhere. The smile that passes between two strangers, the sound of the rain. We see that we're never missing. We're just clinging too tightly to a particular form of what we think we are. So today, as we rise from a wonderful morning of practice, I invite you to look closely. Look closely at where you're trying to sneak forward in the dark. How often are you spending time sewing things together that are better left rent? And when we re-enter the world, we re-enter as someone who, not someone who survived, but someone who's born, moment by moment anew, awakened through the very things that we found challenging. Then Master Hakuin said about this particular case, this is the great death, far from delusion, but also far from enlightenment too. It doesn't mean enlightenment in the sense of actually having truly embodied it. It means from some idea of enlightenment. So recognize the body of the Buddha in your hardships. And embrace your suffering as the face of the Tathagata. Let your life, just as it is, be present in the daylight. And walk it fully.